Now back in page.js, when we click on this add entry button on the modal, it should trigger a new handler function. This handler function will have a reference to our amount field as well as the description field. This handler function will then also add a new document to Firestore. Let's start off by creating this handler function. Within our component, I'll actually add a comment called handler functions, and I'll call this function add income handler. Because we're submitting a form, we do want to deal with the event, and we want to prevent defaults. Prevent default is a built-in JavaScript function. This will prevent the page from refreshing when we submit the form. We will now hook up this function to our form. On our form, we can now add a new event called onSubmit, and we'll hook up our handler function at this point. In order for our handler function to get a reference to the values of these two fields, we'll use the React useRef hook. So at the top of our code, we will also import useRef. Just below this state, we'll add a new variable. We'll call it amount ref. And for this, we'll call useRef. I will create another variable for the description ref, and we'll hook it up to useRef. In the handler function, I'll actually create a new object which contains these two fields, new income, and I'll give it a field called amount, which has a value of amount ref.current.value. I will also add a field for the description with a value of description ref.current.value. In order to test this, we can console log this object, new income. Let's save this. Back in our project, I'll open up the developer tools, console. After opening the console, we can see we've got a few errors over here. It's just saying each child in the list should have a unique key. We'll resolve that issue in a minute. But for now, let's see if we can console log this new object values. So I'll open up the income modal. Let's enter a value like 250 and test. Let's click on add entry, and we're getting an error message saying amount ref is undefined. That is because we haven't hooked up our references to the input fields yet. Back in the code, let's go to the fields. For the amount field, we'll add a new prop called ref. I'll call it amount ref. And in the description, I'll add a new ref, and we'll hook it up to the description ref. Let's try again. We can now see the object in the console. Lastly, I do want to populate the created at timestamp as well. So in this object, I'll add a new field called created at, and we'll pass in a new date. Let's submit this. And yes, we can see the amount coming through the description as well as the timestamp. These are the values that we'll be submitting to Firestore. Now let's have a look at resolving this error message over here with the key prop. When we scroll down to the area where we list out the expenses, we need to make a small change. In React, when we're mapping through a list of items and rendering them out in a list, React requires us to pass in a key property. It needs a unique value to be passed to it. For this, I'll just pass in expense.id. Now, if we refresh this page, it should be resolved, which it is. We no longer get that error. Let's enter the amount again and a description, add entry, and we can see the record pulling through. Now let's add the logic to write this entry to the database. I'll remove the console log, and for this we'll actually import a few objects from Firebase. I'll try to explain some of these functions to you, but I really recommend also having a look at the Firebase documentation if you do get stuck. The Firestore documentation is excellent. They explain how to do all sorts of functions on these databases, like adding and managing data, reading data, deleting data, etc. So in order to add a document to Firestore, you first need a reference to the collection. As a reminder, the collection is called income. We will first import a few things from Firebase. To keep the code neat, I'll add a new comment called Firebase. We'll import something from our Firebase file. And what we need is a reference to the database. Then we'll import a few things from Firebase Firestore. And from Firestore, we need to import the collection function as well as the add doc function. So in our handler function, we will first create that reference to the collection. We can just call it something like collection ref. We will use the collection function. And this function requires that we pass in a reference to that Firestore database, which we've imported as DB. Secondly, we need to pass in the path to the collection. In our case, it's only called income. We can now add our document by calling the add doc function. Add doc takes this collection ref as input. The second parameter is the data, which is new income. The add doc function will return a promise which we can await, which also means we need to change our function to an async function. And what add doc will do is return the document as it exists in the Firestore database. I will call that doc snapshot. It's also a good idea to deal with any exceptions. So I'll wrap this in a try catch block. I will move this function into the try. The catch block will just console log any errors. Let's try this. I will change this value to something like this. I'll just keep this as test and I'll click add entry. Going back to our Firestore page, we can see a new entry in this collection and we can now see the newly created document. Let's try one more time. I'll just make this one 150 and I'll call this something like allowance. Add entry. Swapping back to Firestore, we can see the entry here. Now that we have a few documents in the income table, we can add the logic to write out the income history list. For this, let's go back to our modal. Below this form, we want another div. This div will contain this header with income history. We will give this a few class names. Text 2XL and font bold. I'll also add some styles to this outer div. We will align items to flex. We'll align everything vertically. I'll add a gap and a margin top of 6. Below this header, we'll start looping through the income entries. But before we can do that, we need to store these income entries somewhere. And since we want to re-render this list every time new entries are added or entries are removed, we want to use state. So back in our component, just below this state over here, or maybe just above it, I'll add a new state called income. I'll also create a function called setIncome. This will use state, and initially it will be an empty array. What we'd like to do is after this component has rendered, we would want to fetch all income entries from Firebase and then add those entries in this income array. In order to fetch data and set the state after the component has rendered, we will need to use useEffect. So from React, we will also import useEffect. The useEffect hook, if you're not familiar with it, is ideal for data fetching. So in our component, just before we render the output, we will call useEffect. UseEffect takes two arguments. The first is a function. The second is an array of dependencies. If you leave this array initial, it means that this useEffect will only run once. If we wanted the data to be refetched, if any of the other states had to change, we could add those states in this list. Because we don't have any dependent states, we'll just leave this initial. In this function, we will start fetching data from Firebase. Again, we need to create a reference to the collection. I need to pass in the database reference and then the path to the collection, which is just called income. We need to give this a name, something like collection ref will do. And we can now call another function that comes from the Firebase Firestore package called getDocs. And we will just pass it the collection reference. GetDocs will return a promise. So again, we need to add annotate. And here's one little trick. We are not allowed to change the useEffect function to an async function. So instead, we'll create a new function within useEffect. Something like get income data. And we can wrap this logic in this new function. We can then make this function async. So in the useEffect, we can simply call this new function, get income data. GetDocs will return a query snapshot. So I will just call this docs snapshot. We can have a look at the data that docs snaps will return to us by console logging docs snap.docs. Let's open up the DevTools and let's refresh this page. We can see that we are getting 3 objects back, which makes sense since we do have 3 documents. We will create a new array from this list of documents. So I'll just create a new constant called data. And what we'll do is we'll just loop through docs snap docs map. So for each doc, we will return an object. This object will contain an ID. We can get the document ID from doc.id. We can get the remainder of the fields by destructuring .doc.data. And just one important note, the created at timestamp in Firestore is different to the date object in JavaScript. And you could run into compatibility issues. So we will override the created at value with a new date object. This date object will take in the doc.data field, specifically the created at field that we get from Firebase. In order to convert the Firebase timestamp format to something that JavaScript could understand, we can call this built-in function on the Firebase object called 2millis. So what we're doing here is we are converting the created at timestamp field from Firebase into seconds and then passing that value into a new date object. Now that we have our data, we can set income and we can set our income state equal to data. We can test this out by console logging income. So let's open up our DevTools. I'll clear the console and refresh the page. Initially, the object is just a blank array, but once useEffect completes, we can see the 3 objects pulling through. For each of these objects, we are getting back the amount, the description, the unique ID of the record, as well as a valid timestamp. So in our modal, we can now loop through those income entries by adding the following logic just before the header. We can start our code and we can say income.map. I'll just call it I for a single income, and we'll return something. So what we'll return is an outer div for styling purposes. To avoid any errors, we will remember to pass in a key this time of I.id. We will then create a div which represents the content on the left side of the screen. Within this div, we'll have a paragraph which contains the description. We'll give this description a style of font semi-bold. We can actually see our income entries pulling through. Below the paragraph, I do want to write out the created date and time. So for that, I'll add a small tag and I'll write out the created at value dot to ISO string. I'll also give the small tag some styles, something like text extra small will do. We can now add the amount by creating this p tag. I'll give it a few classes as well. I'll make it aligned flex, item center, and a gap of 2. I'll also call our currency formatter helper function to format this amount. And after saving this, we can now see the amount pulling through as well. We don't want it below these values. We do want it to be aligned to the right. So we'll give this outer div a few styles as well. We will make this flex. We'll center the items. And we'll justify between. That should move it up to the right. Right, so this means when we refresh our application and we click on add income, we can see the income history pulling through. However, if we add a new income entry, we can see it added to our Firestore database, but we don't see it reflecting on the income history. This is because in our handler function, we add the document to Firebase, but the state remains unchanged. So now we also need to add logic to update our state. We will therefore call set income. useState makes it very easy to make changes to the existing state by giving us the previous state. And we can now manipulate this previous state and just return the new state. What we'll return is a new array which contains all of the previous items, but we'll also add our new item here. We will pass it an ID of docsnap.id, which was the ID that we got back from Firebase after it added the document. And we will also pass in the fields of new income. Let's try this out. I will add a value of 8,000 and I'll just call it test 3. Let's click on add entry. And this gives us an error. When we call set income, it's giving us the previous state, but we're supposed to return the new state. At the moment, I'm returning nothing. So I think I've just overwritten the state with nothing. We can resolve that by adding return. Let's try again. I will just give this a value. I'll call this test 4 and click add entry. We can now see test 4 being added to the state. We can also have a look at our database and we can see test 4 added to the database. In the final project, we can also see that we've got this delete button over here. So we are able to add income items, view the history, and we are able to delete income items. So next we'll look at how we can add this delete button. In order to add a delete icon, we do need to import another icon from React Icons. At the top of the page, I will therefore add another import. I'll add a comment just to keep the code clean, and I'll just call this icons. We can import from React Icons -fa, and we'll import fa reg trash alt. I will copy this component and we'll go down to our modal, and below the amount we'll add this component. After saving this, we can see our trash can. We just can't interact with it yet. In order to make it clickable, I'll wrap it in a button, and we'll also attach a handler function to this button. Because we need to reference the ID of the specific item, I'll call a handler function that we're going to create soon. I'll just call it delete income entry handler, and we'll pass it the ID of the specific item. Let's create this handler function. After add income handler, I'll create this new function. This function will take in the income ID, and now we'll call a Firebase function to delete this entry. For this, we need a reference to the specific document. This needs to be imported from Firebase Firestore, so just make sure that you add doc to your list of imports. While we're here, we can also add delete doc. So back in our handler function, we need a reference to the Firestore database, which I'll just call db, and then the path to the specific document. This document sits under income, and the document we want is income ID, which is passed into the handler function. We'll assign this to a variable called docref, and now we can call the delete doc function, passing in the document reference. Delete doc will return a promise, so we can await this. we will change this function to an async function. We also want to deal with any error messages. So I'll wrap this in a try catch block. If we get any errors, I'll just console log the error. This should now delete the document from Firebase. Let's try that. I'll keep Firebase to the left so that we can see these changes. When I delete 4, we can see it disappear from Firebase. Because we haven't updated state yet, we can still see the entry here. If I had to refresh the app, that entry should disappear, which it does. I'll try another one. Let's try and delete allowance. Instantly we can see it disappear. Let's also update the state. Back in our delete income entry handler function, we can update the state. We'll do this by calling the set income function. Again, we'll get the previous state back and we'll return a new state. The new state will simply be the previous state, filter I for the income entries, where I.id is not equals to the income ID that's been deleted. I'm just going to refresh the app. And let's try that. So we'll delete test 3. Test 3 has now been removed from this list and it should be deleted from the database. We can test that out. So if I delete test, we can see it disappear from the database as well as our app. And let's add another value. I'll call it test2, add entry, and we can see it disappear in the database as well as on the app. After adding an entry, the entry is successfully added to the list, but the fields haven't been reset. Let's add some logic to reset these fields after adding the entry. For this, we'll go back to the add income handler function. After successfully setting the state, we want to set the description ref.current.value equals to space. We also want to set the amount ref.current.value equals to space. So now, if we add a new entry, we can see the entry added to the list and the fields are cleared. We've successfully added a new add income modal. We've added logic to implement Firebase Firestore in our project. And we're adding entries to an actual database and fetching data from the database as well. In the next videos, we will have a look at creating modals for this add expenses button and the modal for displaying expense details. But you might be thinking that if we add these modals to this main page file, this file will start to get quite big. Especially if we also add the logic for adding and displaying the expense data in this page file as well. So in the next video, we'll create new components for these modals, and we will also introduce the React Context API into the project. The React Context API will make it very easy for us to share the income and expenses data as well as the helper functions between all of these separate components. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to my channel. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye bye.